steps are. So she is the county director in forest advisory with the University of California Cooperative Extension Center and a technical advisor to the California Board of Forestry. Yana, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And hopefully afterwards, if we have some time, maybe we can get to some questions. But with that, I will pass it along to you.
Well, thanks, Eva. Thanks, Scott, for the invitation, and always so great to hear the work you guys do. You're like the gold standard for me in fire safe councils in California. While I'm live in the North Coast, I get to travel all over California and learn about what other communities are doing and try and cross-pollinate and share ideas. And I'm always pushing folks to your websites and the work you do. So it's really a real pleasure to join you all. So I have some thoughts about Zone Zero. I'm happy to give some updates, timelines, kind of share some of the technical stuff. But if there's any questions people have, maybe you could throw those into the chat so I can make sure that I can answer those. I have some slides because I do think in slides and images because so much of what this is about is really visually based. I don't intend to go through the whole history. But let me just get there here. Yeah, okay. So you all know what happened in 2017 with the really change and uptick around fire frequency and fire severity respective to, it felt really close to home in Redwood Valley. It felt really close to home in the North Bay complex. And, we just saw, continual loss and movement of fire into places where people thought it wasn't possible. And so there was a lot of recognition that business as usual had not been working. And so it was time to be thinking differently, especially respective to this issue related to embers. Because where we were as a culture was much more about fuel mitigation kind of farther away from the house and this sort of fuel break concept and this idea that, we can catch fires on average fire conditions. And that's sort of what we've been preparing for, but not really thinking about this issue where you can see a long distance movement of firebrands and the collection of them near a structure. So if you haven't seen this slide, welcome to it. If you have, pay attention where you want to. But what's really valuable about this slide is it helps illustrate the movement of embers and this idea that you can get all kinds of interactions with the shape of the building depending on the direction that the wind is going. And you can get these vortexes that move air vertically, move air horizontally. But then you also get these hot spots where if you look right on the right-hand side here, you see this really intensity of heat and flame. And what that's about is that the embers are being transported across from the left-hand side of the screen to the right, colliding with a wall and then dropping to the base and basically bringing a bunch of wood pellets, if you will, and aligning them right at the transition point between the wall and the horizontal surface. So Zone Zero came out of an idea of like really trying to help homeowners, business owners, and community members understand their vulnerabilities and understand that, you have to sort of live a little differently and build a little differently and maintain a little differently to be able to withstand these potential ember exposure issues. So what happened was the California's Defensible Space Code comes through the Public Resources Code. That's controlled by the legislature. And so the legislature created a bill to create a new defensible space zone to bring focus right adjacent to the structure. Colloquially, that's been named Zone Zero, and it's the first 5 feet from the building and any attachments out. So here you can see it around the perimeter of the structure and the perimeter of this deck. So that's part of the building itself. It's an attachment. You also see it around ancillary structures. And, the idea was, while we always had Zone 1, didn't really put that fine focus on right what's next to the structure itself. So it passed. And then what happens is when the Public Resources Code 4291 gets updated, it goes to the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection to write the enabling regulations for that. And that process started in 2020, and it's not been smooth. It's been, it's had lots of influence over time. I'm not going to dive into that history, But there's a new draft and it will be heard again in July, and the earliest it could be approved would be August. Um, and so I'll just sort of share what that looks like. This is a home that's in compliance with Zone Zero, just to give some visualization for it. And part of the challenge is I think people really thought it was this kind of scorched dead zone where just nothing, it was hard to kind of visually understand. So we've made a lot of new graphics respective to this. Because a lot of the conversation has been about the very high fire hazard severity zones in local areas, which is where they apply. You're going to see some images that are a little more residential and urban, and that's because audiences have been in those communities have been really struggling to kind of come to terms with. They don't perceive the fire issue as being something that happens in these urban communities. But the evidence is something totally different. We burned, almost 60,000 homes in California. And so it's like, well, folks, it actually really is happening in these urban environments. So where the debate has really been is like, are plants safe and are plants flammable? And how do we think about plants as respective in this kind of fuel conversation? And so, one of the really important notions is that plants change over time. This is lavender, and you can see it in 3 phases of life. It's not very flammable on the left, but without a lot of good management and maintenance of it, it becomes the thing on the right, and it becomes highly flammable and highly receptive to embers. And so, plantlets themselves have limitations because they don't deal with the evolution of the plant over time or how one cares for it. Because, Eva may be amazing at maintaining that lavender, and I may not. And yet it's the same plant, but it has a different line of care. So then there's been a lot of conversation around, it's not just about plant flammability itself, it's also about plant flammability in relation to structures themselves, because it's about the transmission of the fire from the area immediately near the building to the building itself. And so Zone Zero has to address a whole range of building conditions and fit in many different scenarios. So, whether it's this scenario on the right where it's a covered trailer, or more residential in Reading, or, maybe here with wood siding and a wood sill plate, it has to fit into this great context of building conditions. And that includes siding type, kind of how the edge of the wall is finished, the placement of the windows, the depth and quality of the eaves, the level of maintenance. And so, just as a best practice, the more vulnerable the structure, the more separation from fuels really is recommended for a lot of reasons. So the draft now is focusing very much on this edge of wall detail and then the heat trapping quality of the eaves. And so kind of a lot going on in this image here, but I just want to draw your attention to the right, where you can see a structure that looks like it has wood siding. You've got combustible mulch right up to the base of the wall, and you don't really know how that edge of wall is finished. And in many cases, if you were to look underneath, and that's what this image is on the right, you can see the exposed sheathing, which is wood, underneath that siding. And most people have this kind of condition. So meaning that if you get ignition right at the base of the wall from some mulch or plant, it's very easy for the flames to encounter that wood sheathing and get into the wall cavity. So I just want to show what the difference is between an unprotected edge, which is what we see on the right-hand side, and a protected edge, where you can have some flashing that basically tucks underneath that siding, protects the sheathing behind it, also protects the house wrap, because the house wrap often can also be exposed too. And so you have to know how your building is finished. If you have an unprotected edge, the more separation from fuels, the better. So just some other visuals on it. You can see, we often have these punch outs where there maybe be, kind of a bay window underneath. The whole thing's made of wood, which is fantastic for using building products, but it's just more vulnerable. And we also can see, even with stucco, and here's the weep screed, that you can have exposed wood sheathing also sticking out right at that base. So just because you have stucco doesn't mean the way it's assembled doesn't have a vulnerability in it, like this wood sheathing here. So the focus of Zone Zero is really trying to dial into that area right adjacent to the wall. It's also trying to think about these under eave vulnerabilities and the fact that eaves trap heat, and you get that airflow that I was showing with those embers on the earlier image with the firefighter. And so depending on how the under eave area is finished, it's pretty easy for flame to get inside of it. And you need air movement as shown here with these freeze block vents or these soffitted strip vents. But there is, something very important to understand around how the edge of the roof finishes and how, if something does ignite underneath there, how it interacts with your structure. So the new draft of the zone zero basically is trying to flex and accommodate these sort of different conditions. And so the best practice is still a full 5 feet of separation. And I can talk about some of the science around that. But it's built in a little bit more nuance and a little bit more flexibility as sort of a minimum tolerance. It's not going to be the lead on our educational messaging, but you can envision, here's a house, theoretically. Some people have very shallow eaves. Some people have a house with these deep eaves. And so the idea is that the new zone is still going to be 5 feet, but it's asking for full separation of fuels underneath the eaves, at whatever depth the structure has. So if the building has 5 feet of eaves, a big deep overhang, which is great for rain, then it's full 5 feet because of all the heat trapping qualities underneath the structure itself. If the house has a more shallow eave, at least it's providing protection at that base of the wall, and trying to address that kind of base of wall consideration. So the non-combustible zone would be at least a minimum of 5 feet. There's been a lot of conversation about trees, and so these are examples here just to kind of show how the tree issues would be addressed. This is standard, what's been in defensible space since 1965. There's always been a requirement to keep limbs away from chimneys and to keep the limbs away from the roof. They drop a lot of debris. They also, braid on the roof. And so there's just some kind of general good management around how to keep your building in good shape. So a couple visuals, and then I'll just share. The tree conversation comes up a lot, and the boxes in red are a couple illustrations of where I think the conversation would be with your inspector. This is where the focus would be, not on tree removal itself, but really about, limbing away some of these branches that are a little too close and those that are underneath the eaves. And then, of course, the good practice of trying to manage these ladder fuels, meaning the lower branches that allow fire, if it's traveling through the landscape, to climb up into the tree itself. So there's been a lot of misconversation around and misinformation around zone zeros after your trees. And it's not, it's really just about kind of thinking more clearly about how fire might climb into those trees and then how it interacts with the building itself. So I'll close with some visuals that we've been trying to create to sort of give a better sense of what this might look like. And so this would be zone zero compliant. And as would this image. And, as I said, this is, really, we've been trying to push them into more urban audiences. It's not perfect. These are edited images. So this isn't like a true house that actually has zone zero on it. We're trying to use, Photoshop and other abilities to try and illustrate this. But to say, it's not about no vegetation. It's really about being thoughtful about it, thinking about the placement, thinking about the connectivity of that fuel, which can come, in petroleum products, it can come in wood products, it can come in living plants in relation to the building itself. And then I'll just say, so what happens from 5 feet what happens from this drip line out is there's some tolerance for low combustibility items. And so what does that look like? And that can be small potted plants. It can be lawn or other ground covers with a maximum height, and it really needs to be maintained. And then it could include some bulbs and some ground covers, like things like this. So keeping some greenness in there, but really reducing the overall heat capacity so that if any of this does ignite, it's not going to produce a ton of heat to cause risk to the structure. It'll flame out pretty quickly. And, certainly herbaceous plants are lovely and color spots are great, and there's many options that are natives, and there's a lot to kind of consider here. But the new zone zero is, if it gets approved the way it looks to be drafted right now, it's really trying to get the woody stuff out of that first 5 feet. and then allow for some color spots, but not overdoing it. And again, if you are like me and live in a wood house with that unprotected edge, that farther distance that you can create, so much the better. So with that, I think I'll maybe stop and then see if you have any questions. And I was told to keep it short, so I tried to.
That was great. Um, let's see. Carla in the chat wrote a question, what material is acceptable for front porches of homes?
Yeah.
Steps.
You know, so you're talking about either the way you finish the outside edge of the porch, or you're talking about the between the stair treads and the back here. And Carla, feel free to come off. I'm happy to chat about it.
Hi, Yana. I'm Carla Thomas retired from UC Department of Plant Pathology. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you, Carla.
We just had a little earthquake here, so reception's a little tough.
Yeah.
So I'm leaving my picture off. I put the video on, but I don't know, it might slow me down. But anyway, good to see you. So there, I almost appeared. So I've got a home that's 2 or 3 feet off the ground. I just put hardy board double paned windows. It's an older home, but I need to replace the front steps. I'm 3 foot step down for the first step now.
Yeah.
It's on a grade, and so just a traditional stair step isn't very useful. Plus, I want to be able to get underneath the porch because that's where the
Yeah.
water intake is. I
Right.
was thinking about maybe even something like a metal ramp. You can buy metal ramps
Oh, yeah.
for wheelchairs and so forth, and
Right.
stone's not really a good option even either. But I'm looking for something that's consistent with all the fire resiliency of the other parts of the outside of the
hmm
house.
Yeah, I don't have I mean, just at the high level, I don't have a problem with steps in general being of wood. But what I would say is that you probably want to land it on a pad, a cement pad, so that you can keep debris from the base of them. I think the issue with decks in general is that you just need to protect them. You need to be aware of, what you store on them and kind of clean out the gaps, because it's the ember issue that lands on the debris in between the deck boards that can create ignition, or is the stuff that's when the embers fall through the deck, that is ignited below. So keeping it clean below is the really important piece. And it rains a lot here, and birds drop seeds all the time, and so stuff gets going. And so the ability to get under the deck is really important. When the deck is below 4 feet in height, we generally recommend that it gets wrapped in a mesh screen to keep the embers out, and that allows the airflow to continue to move, which is important. But then you need to create a little way to get in there, and need to create a little, a gate or a kind of a door to get yourself in there. You don't want to seal it up with something that doesn't breathe, because then you can have moisture issues underneath the deck, because the deck will, you've got soil moisture and rain that comes through it. So don't do that. Um, I think for people that are, really concerned about steps, there's all kinds of, I'm forgetting the name of them. They come in about the same equivalency of like a 2x6, and you'll see them like at a ski resort where people are climbing steps, and the snow falls through them, and so you're not trapping snow as you climb up the steps. You could build basically a set of steps that are made out of metal. That's an option. Um, in general, there's some guidance around building decks new that make a lot of sense to me, which is increasing the gaps between the deck boards, and then capping the top of the deck joists with foil tape, so that if embers do land on it, they don't smolder and transmit down the deck joist from one board to the next. And it's relatively inexpensive to install, and can make a difference in that way. The most important thing is to be thinking about basically fuel and flammable items underneath the deck and immediately around that deck. So, the deck needs some extra extra care and attention. I do things like I have a cabin and I bring my doormats in when I leave the cabin. I bring my broom in, I bring all that flammable stuff and I leave it inside because I go away from that cabin for weeks at a time. So just be thinking about, when we move into these critical fire weather conditions, what's out there on the deck? What could you move? What could you relocate during that time period? We have fewer days on the coast range, on the coast side of when we're in those days. So, behavior changes are I think, achievable. And then when we live, more where, fire weather conditions happen all the time, just sort of being thoughtful in general about what we put on those decks. Does that answer your question?
Yep, that's great. How about flammable or fabric that's for block? I've got gravel in ditches all around the house, but
Yeah.
I've got that fabric you put to keep the weeds down.
Yeah,
Is
the
that
weed cloth.
flammable?
Yeah, I mean, if you're covering it and concealing it, it's not going to produce a lot of heat in general. I mean, the weed management is a real challenge. Here, I'm going to throw out something I did for my cabin, and it's kind of dorky. But I had a bunch of old metal roofing, and I put those roofing panels underneath, just laying on the ground because I didn't care about the roofing. It had like the tin roofing, it had gotten old. Um, but it's really helped my weed management issues substantially. And so now I just have a few spots where I have to kind of fine tune things here and there. Um, so trying to figure out the system. If you put the gravel down without some kind of weed barrier, you're still going to get blackberry seeds and those germinating, and that's hard. So I don't have the perfect solution. Um, I will say that one of the elegant ones is old sheetrock does really well in weed control. And then you would need to cover it so you don't see it because it can be a little unsightly, but it also works effectively in that
I've
space.
got lots of that around
Yeah.
in Westport. Well,
Right.
good to see you again, and a big fan of all the work you do.
Thank you so much.
FYI on that, so Sonoma has a four-part series going on landscaping. And last night's session covered weed management and the next one will too. And we'll be putting those up with links to them. But they were recommending kind of a layer of kind of uh, what is it, crushed granite, like a couple inches instead of weed cloth as a more kind of environmentally friendly and weed deterring approach. But there's, like I say, we'll share a link with a bunch of material that focuses on that probably in the next month.
Yeah, and I've got some of that crushed granite stuff, and you really can compact it down, and it's not perfect, but it's pretty low cost overall. And so I'm seeing, the deck is a little different than like kind of in that zone zero, like around the house. And so you can make a really nice look with that sort of crushed granite and then put a few pavers in there. Only thing I don't like about the granite is it can be kind of dirty, meaning that you sort of need a clean spot to wipe your feet before you come into the house because it sticks for me on my shoes a lot, and that's made another issue. So you'll figure out what works for you, but yeah, I think that system works really well in general.
I have a question, Yana. So for a long time, we had just been very simply saying, okay, zone zero means clearing all combustible vegetation 0 to 5 feet from your house. And now with the kind of nuance of it depends on how far out your eaves are. So if my eaves are only 1 foot out, there's 4 feet that needs to be in this low combustible zone. It's not necessarily no vegetation like you were talking about. I just, I feel like that is going to be it's hard for people to know, like what is low. It feels more like a
I think
perception,
if
Yeah.
from the educational messaging point, these are the minimum standards for California. And I think, our messaging is not going to change. 5 feet is what's recommended. And that's in part because everybody's house is so different and it has so many unique vulnerabilities and people don't see those vulnerabilities that well. So for me, I feel like our messaging is going to stay in that 5 feet. I think you're going to see ready, set, go kind of stay in that same 5 feet framework. But here's sort of setting the threshold and the bar. Like it shouldn't go any lower than what is coming out of this draft. And it's really in response to these communities where you have small lots and there's maybe only 7 feet to the property line, and folks have been really struggling in that space. One of the other challenges, like the lawn was an issue some time ago because you can't mandate an irrigation standard and because it's a water related issue. A green lawn itself is not that flammable, but it doesn't take long till you have a water line break or you have some kind of irrigation, malfunction, and then that lawn isn't green anymore. Well, it's better be cut. If we only have an inspection, with some periodicity once a year, every 5 years, like that lawn changes condition all the time. So for me, I feel like the message is really trying to focus in on the vulnerability of the structure and then saying the more vulnerable, like the best practice really is something that is more involved than this kind of mixed use of low combustibility and such. Um, so Eva, we can keep talking about this once we finally have the final standards and sort of think about how we frame that. I've been currently just thinking about like this is the tolerance, but maybe not the way to start. But I also feel like people, have to approach this and have to figure out a way into it. And so, working their way into it is better than just fighting it the whole way. So like, what can you do with a rake over the weekend and then some shears? And then how do you get to that sort of next step along the process is, I think part of the challenge and part of the opportunity, and everyone's going to find it in a different way.
Yeah. Have you been hearing more about, so there's kind of what the regulations are, what maybe CAL FIRE is going to tell you you need to do on your defensible space assessment, but then there's insurance. And so I'm just curious if you've heard more from like insurance companies or if there's any, I mean, I know that there are private industries,
Mhm.
so it's, hard to get them to say anything concrete, but
Yeah, I mean, I don't speak for the insurance industries.
yeah.
They certainly are watching this carefully. This will be the first full comprehensive statewide standard in the United States, as far as I'm aware. So the variability is challenging. I don't think they're going to love this draft, but we kind of have to thread the needle somewhere. And if it was too extreme, then the public reaction was too much. And, I think at least we're going to be in a place where we can really kind of dial in and sort of talk about these vulnerabilities in a more clear and coherent way.
Yeah.
And um, and there's a lot of interest in plants. Like people want plant lists, and they're going to continue to focus in on that. And so, the plant research space is where some of my programming is going, and where other people's programmings are going. And so, trying to navigate through that. We did an experiment recently. And we tested, this was just radiant heat, so a burning shed, like a pump shed size, um, with a 10 mile to 15 mile an hour wind, 10 feet away from plants that were potted. And they were either let to dry or irrigated that morning. So they were at a full saturation, or they're still green, leaves weren't crispy. Which plants do you think ignited first?
Yeah, the one that wasn't watered.
They ignited at the same time.
Mm. Okay.
And that's because the radiant heat
Yeah.
component overloaded the plant. The plant was not able to use its vascular system to bring additional water up to be able to deal with the desiccation of the 2 minutes. It was just 2 minutes of heat exposure and 10-mile-an-hour winds on a 70-degree day, like not critical fire weather conditions. And it overwhelmed the plant, and the plant ignited,
Mhm.
fully hydrated. It was pittosporum or pittosporum, however you want to call it. We wanted to use camellia, but we couldn't get 90 camellias at a certain height. So the pittosporum is what we could find. So it's a waxy cuticled leaf. It's from New Zealand originally. You see it in hedges all over the place. And in New Zealand, it's thought to be fire resistant. But, it like we really have a struggle in trying to talk about plants in any coherent way. And then the practices piece, because everybody manages their landscape differently and nobody can anticipate both the irrigation challenges or a physical disability or, something that comes along the way that interrupts people's efforts. So,
Sorry, one more. I'm gonna just
yeah.
keep going until someone else, anyone else can raise their hand or jump in. But for wooden fences, because I know that was also a part of the conversation around zone zero of having wooden fences attached to homes. Is that a part of, did I just miss it when you
Oh,
covered
no,
it?
I didn't talk about
Okay.
fences. So, the fencing standards are that, so you still, let me back up. Their fences come in two ways. They attach to the structure perpendicularly, and we have a gate typically there.
Hmm.
And so there's been clear and consistent interest in making sure that people understand that that gate and that attachment point should be upgraded to something non-combustible. Because fire travels down those fences and comes directly to the structures. The piece that's been a little less clear has been what to do with parallel fences. And these are for small lots is where we see it the most, where the fence is within 5 feet. And so right now what the draft standard says is that you can do repair, but when it comes time for replacement, that the replacement itself in that space that's within 5 feet, so not the whole length of the fence, but maybe the 20 feet that's near the house, it'd be better to do something that's non-combustible there.
Okay.
So there's some things to think about. And, when the fence is parallel, like what are the windows along that section? Are they single pane, which makes them even more vulnerable? There's a lot of things to kind of work through, and it's not a simple answer, but the draft has some guidance, but it's not as draconian as I think, and I think that's useful.
Yeah. Wendy.
Yeah, I just wanted to share for the people that live near the Mendocino coast. They're finally starting to carry 1 or 2 different brands of Class A rated decking material. And one of the companies, it's called TimberTech. They're actually coming out with custom-made aluminum foundations for under decks, because that's always been the problem, as the guest speaker mentioned, that as you have to leave those expansion joints between your deck boards, the embers can fall down there, and then you've got timber that's readily available to burn. So they're coming out with these new aluminum substructures that you can mount your deck boards to. So it's been very slow. I've been searching for almost 2 years now, looking for fencing substitutes and decking substitutes that are truly Class A rated, and they're just finally starting to hit the market here on the Mendocino coast. So Mendo Mill is carrying those, and just wanted to let the group know that.
That's great, Wendy. Thank you so much. I feel like that is something that we've all noticed is we're really behind in some of those fire resistant materials, and so it's always good to get a local tip of where people can find it. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and I mean, when it comes to all those new products, one of the things I'll say is like it's good to understand how they perform over time. Like the original Trex didn't perform very well at all. It had a lot of friability. It broke down, and some of the challenges with the composites are that they don't have structural integrity compared to our typical wood products that we use. And so you have to build a bigger substructure underneath them to be able to support the deck. So that underdecking is a whole nother conversation, and so it'll be good to see how those perform and meet those needs. In any case, it's all about fuel management underneath the deck. Like no matter what the product is, you really have to be thoughtful about what happens under the deck and right around the deck.
Mm-hmm. Pam in the chat was asking about fire resistant paint, if you know anything about that.
Yeah, I know some about fire resistant paint. I know some about gels and coatings. And what I would say to folks is think about the fuel management first before you start to go down these pathways. There's not a lot of testing in our area or with your product or our rain environment or our sun environment as to exactly how long these intumescent coatings last, which is kind of what's in that fire resistant paint. So recognize that they're mostly product promoted items that don't have a lot of independent testing respected to them, and it's pretty messy to try and do that work in all these different environments because everyone's climatic conditions are different and everyone's wear and tear patterns are different. So I guess I just really encourage people to think more about the fuel management. Vertical things don't ignite. You have to have a horizontal fire, a surface fire for the vertical to ignite. So if you're worried about siding, really just think about that fuel management at the base of the wall. That's what's going to be the primary driver. And then think about other structures that may be close to that wall, like the ancillary shed, and give them a thorough line of protection to protect your siding on your structure.
You briefly mentioned the timeline was, and I wrote it down, but it was like August would be the earliest this is adopted. Is that correct?
Yeah,
And can you talk just a little bit about what that would look like when once it's
yeah.
confirmed
So
what that means and yeah.
right, so it goes, so it's now at the full board, it's out of the committee. So the full board's gonna get an introduction to it in July, they only meet monthly. And then they're gonna have a full hearing focused in on it for August. It's in Sacramento and they could approve it at that point. What that would mean is that it applies immediately for new construction. So this is what's really important. Like right now, we're still building homes that aren't even thinking about these issues and there's no standard related to it. So we really need to get new construction in line. There's a whole phase-in period for existing construction and there's a time period to work through that. And it's not meant to be draconian, it's really meant to kind of step folks through this. And so the draft standards have some ideas around what that phasing looks like. And, it's really about making a plan and making some progress and figuring out what's doable and understanding that people may need to hire some folks and they may need to budget for that, or work parties may need to come together. And there's a lot of this year's legislative package has a lot of ideas around how to generate some access to capital and new monies and ways to support people through this stuff. So it's a work in progress, but I think there's going to be more resources coming down the line.
Mhm. Okay, that's good to know. Cindy.
Yeah, oops. Okay. I was wondering, we need to replace an old shed. And I'm wondering about the options for aluminum siding on a shed. The negatives are that in our climate in the winter time, the aluminum siding apparently causes condensation on the inside. And so they suggest lining that with some kind of insulation. And of course, the inside of the shed is generally wood.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if the siding really helps that much. Does it have a tendency to melt in the heat? Could it be applied over a 5/8 inch T111? Like that's how the shed comes? What do you think about that?
How close is the shed to the structure, to the house or garage?
To the house? It's quite a ways away.
Okay.
It's yeah. Unfortunately, it's closer to our propane tank.
Right. Well, the reason I raise that is because if you're thinking about that additional verification that comes from the IBHS wildfire prepared home, there are some minimum separations between structures and the main building. And if you're building new, if you can push it farther away from the structure, the better. I have a challenge where I have a wood shed that's at the property line. I don't have any other place to put it. I'll never be able to meet that standard because it's just, the practicality of it. So the farther away those ancillary structures are, the generally better, because then you don't have the radiant heat exposure that might create from the ignition of that ancillary structure to your primary structure. In terms of shed material,
probably 30 feet away.
That's great. Build it well if you can afford it. And, you can see standalone metal sheds. One of the issues with them is they have heat transfer through them also. So like if you store your chemicals in there and you've got something else near to them that ignites, you can get radiant heat movement through the wall, and that could be an issue. I think just use your standard building practices where you're going to be thinking about the conditioned space, unconditioned space, how you manage that moisture, where that house wrap line lies itself. Metal's is not cheap. So, even the cement board is probably less expensive than the metal itself. And it just depends on what your aesthetics are too, what you're trying to achieve visually. I guess maybe Cynthia, you can follow up with me and we can talk some more about like what you're trying to make out of that and what you want what that shed experience to look like, and whether it's totally tight or not. If you keep insects out of it.
Yeah, we've thought about the cement board as well, um, and even thinking about I've been thinking about whether to get a metal framing instead of wood, but
I mean,
that wouldn't
metal
matter.
that the interior of the building doesn't really matter. It's about keeping fire from the
Okay.
outside coming in, unless you're storing your chemicals in it, and then you're making then you're building something that you got fire
No,
guard.
wouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Metal, I mean, the
The other thing,
interior from exterior fire perspectives, metal framing doesn't do anything beneficial from a fire protection point.
I'm
Okay.
sorry, the metal framing
Doesn't
wouldn't
add doesn't
be.
add it adds
I mean,
cost.
yeah, and the metal siding isn't that protective either.
Well, it's not ignitable. I think it depends on what you
Yeah.
do with the siding. Think about it like there's the wiggle. If you have corrugation and you typically plug it with wiggle board, which is a wood product. And so that can have place, if you don't plug it, then you're gonna have insects and potentially mice getting in there. It depends on
Yeah.
seam. I don't know what it looks like. Let's talk offline. I don't want to overwhelm these folks with the details of that issue, but
Great.
And a lot of the sheds that come, they just have wood bases that they sit on.
Mhm.
And I was thinking about a concrete base, but I don't know if that's
Sure.
um,
Great.
would help at all if embers get under between the concrete and the structural supports underneath the shed. I don't know if that makes any difference.
There's a lot of great mesh out there that can solve a lot of problems and make a lot of things go away. Some of it even comes in a black color, so it's not very visually, um, it's not bright and shiny, and so it can be more visually appealing. That can deal with weird transition spots and funny places that can help.
Thank you. Um, okay, great. Well, Yana, I think that was an amazing encapsulation of something that has been going on for 6 years and has been very confusing and hard to follow with the Zone Zero conversation and details. So I'm just like so grateful that you're here to to make it easy for us and just tell us what's happening. I'm very curious what's going to happen in August. We will definitely follow up with this group as well as a bunch of with all of our newsletters when this actually is finalized and approved to let people know. But this was just really incredible, and thank you again for joining us. And if everyone else wants to, oh yeah, go for it.
One last plus I'll say
Yeah.
if you like what you saw here, I'm sure the board would appreciate some like thank you for giving some flexibility and we generally like this or we can live with it. They
Yeah.
mostly get, what the heck are you thinking kind of letters. So
You want to put that where they would send like
uh,
an email maybe or something,
yeah,
or you can just
I'll look for
you can
that well and
email
then I'll let
me.
you move on. So
You can also email it to me and I can just put it in my